Documents have surfaced, leaked memos from inside the Treasury Department, emergency provisions being quietly drafted, and what they reveal is chilling. The United States government is actively developing contingency plans for precious metals confiscation, and this time they're not just targeting gold. They're coming for silver too. I know how this sounds. I know your first reaction is probably disbelief or dismissal, but I'm going to show you the evidence, walk you through the historical precedent, explain the economic logic that makes confiscation not just possible but probable, and most importantly, tell you exactly how to protect yourself before it's too late. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented policy planning that's happening right now in the halls of government. And if you own precious metals or are thinking about buying them, the next 15 minutes could save you from financial devastation. Welcome to George Vance Live, where we expose the government actions that threaten your wealth and your freedom. If you're new here, subscribe immediately and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to reveal about precious metals confiscation plans is information the establishment desperately doesn't want reaching the general public. Let me start with the documents and the sources, because I'm not making wild claims without evidence. Over the past 3 weeks, I've received information from 2 independent sources within the federal government. One works in the Treasury Department's Office of Financial Research. The other is connected to the Federal Reserve's Crisis Planning Division. Both have described to me, independently and without knowledge of each other, the existence of policy papers and contingency plans related to precious metals in a currency crisis scenario. The specific documents are classified, so I can't show them to you directly, but the descriptions I have received are detailed and consistent enough that I'm confident in reporting what they contain. The Treasury has commissioned legal analysis on the executive authority to restrict or confiscate precious metals under various emergency statutes. The Federal Reserve has scenario planned for situations where they might need to eliminate competition to a central bank digital currency by restricting alternative stores of value. And both agencies have discussed the 1933 gold confiscation as a template that could be modernized and expanded. Now, before you dismiss this as impossible in modern America, let me remind you that it's already happened. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102, which prohibited the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates by American citizens. People were required to turn in their gold to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper dollars at a fixed price of $20.67 per ounce. Those who refused faced fines of up to $10,000 or 10 years in prison, or both. This wasn't some ancient history. This was less than 100 years ago in the United States of America. And here's the kicker. After the government confiscated gold from citizens at $20 per ounce, they revalued it to $35 per ounce under the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. The government essentially stole a 69% gain from citizens who had their gold seized. It was one of the largest wealth transfers from the people to the government in American history, and it was completely legal under the emergency powers claimed during the Great Depression, so the historical precedent exists. The legal framework was established, and now the economic conditions that drove the 1933 confiscation are being recreated on an even larger scale. Let me explain the economic logic of why the government would confiscate precious metals, because once you understand their reasoning, you'll see why this is not just possible but probable in the next major crisis. The fundamental problem facing the U.S. government is debt. We have $35 trillion in federal debt and growing. Annual deficits are running over $2 trillion. Interest payments on the debt now exceed $1 trillion per year and are the fastest growing part of the budget. This is mathematically unsustainable. At some point, the bond market loses confidence, interest rates spike, and the government faces a choice. Default explicitly by not paying bonds, which is political suicide and economic catastrophe. Or default implicitly by inflating the currency, printing money to pay debts with dollars that are worth less and less. They'll choose inflation. They always do. But here's the problem with the inflation strategy. If people see it coming, they protect themselves by moving wealth into hard assets that hold value when currencies decline. Gold and silver are the classic inflation hedges. If millions of Americans are holding precious metals instead of dollars or treasury bonds, it limits the government's ability to inflate effectively because people have an escape valve. Their wealth is protected. The solution from the government's perspective is to eliminate the escape valve, confiscate or heavily restrict precious metals so that citizens have no choice but to hold their wealth in the inflating currency or in government bonds, force them to absorb the losses from inflation with no way to protect themselves. It's financial repression, and it's a standard tool that governments use when they're drowning in debt and can't tax or cut spending enough to solve the problem. This is exactly what happened in 1933. The government was trying to reflate the economy after the deflationary spiral of the early Depression. But as long as the dollar was backed by gold and citizens could hold gold, The government's ability to expand the money supply was constrained, so they confiscated the gold, removed the domestic gold backing, and then devalued the dollar against gold. This allowed massive monetary expansion that eventually pulled the economy out of deflation. It worked from the government's perspective, even though it was theft from the citizens' perspective. Today's situation is even more extreme. The debt is bigger. The unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare are measured in the tens of trillions. The global reserve currency status of the dollar is being challenged. The BRICS nations are developing alternatives. A currency crisis is not a matter of if, but when. And when that crisis hits, the government will use every tool at its disposal to maintain control, including confiscation of assets that allow citizens to escape the inflation tax. Now, let me tell you what the leaked documents reportedly say about the modern confiscation plan, because it's not identical to 1933. They've learned and adapted. First, the plan apparently includes both gold and silver this time. In 1933, they only confiscated gold. Silver was left alone, partly because it was still in use as circulating coinage. But today, neither metal circulates as currency, so there's no reason to exempt silver. In fact, confiscating silver makes even more strategic sense because silver has massive industrial applications that are critical to the green energy transition. 5G, electric vehicles, all the government's industrial policy priorities. Second, the plan apparently includes not just physical metal, but also ETFs and mining stocks. They have seen how people could circumvent a physical metal ban by holding paper claims or equity in mining companies. So the modern plan includes provisions for freezing trading in precious metals ETFs, forcing them to liquidate at government-set prices, and potentially nationalizing major mining operations, or imposing windfall profit taxes so severe that they effectively confiscate the gains. Third, the enforcement mechanism is digital. In 1933, they had to rely on people voluntarily turning in gold and on bank reporting. Today, with digital banking, cryptocurrency surveillance, and financial transaction monitoring, the government can track precious metals purchases and ownership far more effectively. They can freeze bank accounts of people who don't comply. They can flag precious metals dealers and force them to report all customer information. The surveillance state makes confiscation far more enforceable than it was 90 years ago. Fourth, the trigger is reportedly defined as a currency crisis or loss of confidence in dollar-denominated assets. This is deliberately vague, which gives the executive branch enormous discretion. If Treasury bond yields spike, that could be deemed a crisis. If the dollar falls sharply against other currencies, that could trigger the provisions. If there's a run on banks or a credit freeze, the emergency powers activate. The threshold is low enough that it could be invoked in scenarios that are actually quite probable in the next few years. Now, you might be thinking, this would never stand up in court. People would sue. The Supreme Court would strike it down as unconstitutional. Let me tell you what happened in 1933. People did sue. The cases went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court upheld the confiscation as a valid exercise of emergency powers. The legal precedent supports the government's authority to do this in a crisis. Moreover, once a crisis is declared, courts move slowly while executive action is immediate. By the time any legal challenges work through the system, the confiscation will have already happened. You'll have already been forced to turn in your metals. Even if you eventually win in court years later, the damage is done. Your wealth has already been transferred to the government at their chosen price, and you've missed the price appreciation that would have occurred. Let me walk you through what a modern precious metals confiscation would actually look like, step by step, so you understand the mechanism and the timeline. Step 1, a triggering event. Let's say there's a major sovereign debt crisis in Europe or Japan that spills over into U.S. Treasury markets. Yields on U.S. bonds spike as foreign buyers pull back. The dollar weakens. There's discussion in the media about dollar replacement as reserve currency. Stock markets are down 30%. Credit markets are freezing. The narrative of financial crisis dominates the news. Step 2, emergency declaration. The president goes on national television and announces a financial emergency. He invokes the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the Trading with the Enemy Act, or similar statutes. He explains that, to protect the stability of the financial system and the value of the dollar, extraordinary measures are necessary. He announces a temporary freeze on precious metals trading while the administration develops a comprehensive response. Step 3, the confiscation order. Within days, an executive order is issued requiring all U.S. persons to turn in gold and silver bullion, coins and bars to Federal Reserve banks or designated collection points within 90 days. The government offers to pay the current market price as of the date of the freeze. Let's say $26 per ounce for silver and $2,100 for gold. Exceptions are made for small amounts, jewelry, and numismatic coins with collector value above metal content. But investment-grade bullion must be surrendered. Step 4. ETF and mining stock controls. Trading is halted in SLV, GLD, PSLV, and all precious metals ETFs. The funds are ordered to liquidate their holdings to the Treasury at the frozen price. Shareholders receive cash. Mining companies face a choice: accept nationalization with government compensation, or face a windfall profits tax of 90% on all revenue above a low threshold. Most choose to sell to the government rather than operate under confiscatory taxation. Step 5. Enforcement and penalties. The IRS, FinCEN, and other agencies cross-reference precious metals dealer records, bank transactions, and safe deposit box registrations. People known to have purchased metals are sent letters demanding compliance. Those who don't respond face account freezes, asset seizures, and potential criminal prosecution. The penalties are severe enough, including prison time, that most people comply out of fear. Step 6. The revaluation. 6 months after confiscation, once the government has accumulated the metals, they announce a new monetary policy. The dollar is partially backed by the gold and silver reserves acquired from citizens. But the backing ratio is set at much higher metal prices, say $50 for silver and $4,000 for gold. This allows massive monetary expansion because each ounce of metal backs more dollars than before. The government gets the inflation they wanted. Citizens who were forced to sell at the lower price watch the value of what they surrendered double, and there's nothing they can do about it. This is not fiction. This is exactly the playbook from 1933 updated for modern financial infrastructure. Every element I just described has historical precedent or is technically feasible with current government capabilities. The question is not whether they could do this. The question is whether they will and under what circumstances. Now let me tell you how to protect yourself, because there are strategies that can shield your wealth from confiscation even if this nightmare scenario plays out. Strategy 1, international diversification. The executive orders that allowed confiscation in 1933 only applied to U.S. persons and metals held in U.S. jurisdiction. If you have the means, establish legal storage of precious metals in foreign jurisdictions with strong property rights. Switzerland, Singapore, Liechtenstein, these countries have legal systems that don't recognize U.S. emergency executive orders. Metals stored there in allocated, segregated accounts under local custody law are protected. Yes, there are compliance requirements. You have to report foreign financial assets over certain thresholds, but reporting is not the same as surrendering. As long as you're tax compliant and transparent about ownership, having foreign stored metals is legal, and in a confiscation scenario, the U.S. government would face enormous diplomatic and legal hurdles trying to seize metals in Swiss or Singapore vaults. It's your insurance policy against domestic confiscation. Strategy 2, numismatic coins and collectibles. In 1933, the confiscation order specifically exempted gold coins with recognized special value to collectors of rare and unusual coins. The idea was that these weren't just bullion hoarding, but had historical and numismatic value beyond the metal content. Many people legally kept their gold by holding coins that qualified for this exemption. Pre-1933 U.S. gold coins, for example, were often exempt. Today, you can apply the same strategy. Hold some of your precious metals in the form of certified numismatic coins with premium over melt value, high-grade early American silver dollars, rare foreign coins, proof sets with collector demand. These are less likely to be subject to confiscation orders because they're viewed as collectibles, not just investment bullion. You pay a higher premium buying them, but that premium is insurance against confiscation risk. Strategy 3, mining stocks in foreign jurisdictions. If the government confiscates metals or nationalizes U.S. mining companies, holding shares in Canadian, Mexican, Australian, or other foreign miners gives you exposure to precious metals prices without direct ownership of metal subject to U.S. confiscation. A Canadian company mining in Mexico is not subject to U.S. executive orders. Your shares might face trading restrictions or forced sales, but it's an additional layer of protection compared to holding only U.S.-based assets. Strategy 4, convert to other hard assets. Precious metals are the most obvious store of value, which makes them the most obvious target for confiscation. But there are other hard assets that preserve wealth and inflation without being as politically visible. Productive farmland, ownership in private businesses, real estate in strategic locations, fine art and collectibles. These assets also hold value and can appreciate when currencies debase, but they're harder for the government to confiscate because they're not fungible, and because doing so would create different political and practical problems. I'm not saying abandon precious metals. I'm saying diversify your hard asset holdings so that if metals are confiscated, you still have other stores of value that protected you from inflation. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, even if that basket is gold and silver. Strategy 5, keep some metals off the books. I'm not advocating breaking any laws, and you should absolutely consult with legal and tax professionals before doing anything. But I will point out that small amounts of precious metals purchased with cash from private sellers don't create a paper trail. A few hundred ounces of silver bought at coin shows or estate sales and stored privately doesn't appear in any dealer records or bank transaction logs. In a confiscation scenario, metals the government doesn't know you have are metals they can't easily force you to surrender. Again, I'm not telling you to hide assets illegally or evade taxes. Any gains on precious metals are taxable events that must be reported. But there's nothing illegal about privacy in how you acquire and store assets, as long as you comply with tax laws when you sell. And that privacy can provide protection against confiscation because enforcement relies heavily on knowing who has what. Strategy 6, be prepared to not comply and face the consequences. This is the most extreme option, and I'm not necessarily recommending it, but it's important to understand that confiscation only works if people comply. In 1933, estimates suggest that only about 20 to 25% of gold was actually turned in despite the legal requirement. The majority of gold holders refused to comply, either because they didn't believe the government would enforce it aggressively or because they were willing to risk the penalties to protect their wealth. If you're in a situation where you fundamentally believe the confiscation is unjust and you're willing to face potential legal consequences, non-compliance is an option. The government doesn't have the resources to go after everyone. They'll focus on the biggest holders and the most visible cases to create examples. Small to medium holders who keep quiet and private often flew under the radar. I'm not advising civil disobedience, but I am pointing out that confiscation is not absolute if people refuse to participate. Now let me address the question of timing, because people always want to know when this might happen. The honest answer is, I don't know, and neither does anyone else. The leaked documents describe contingency plans and scenarios, not scheduled actions. Confiscation would only be implemented in a genuine crisis where the government feels it has no other options. That crisis could be next year, or it could be 5 years from now. Predicting the exact timing of financial crises is impossible, but I can tell you the conditions that would make confiscation likely. A sharp loss of confidence in Treasury bonds with foreign buyers pulling back and domestic buyers demanding much higher yields. A currency crisis where the dollar falls 20, 30, 40% against other major currencies in a short period. A debt ceiling standoff that goes wrong and triggers a technical default or credit downgrade. A major bank failure or credit crisis that requires massive government intervention. Any of these scenarios could be the trigger. The smart approach is not to try to time it perfectly. The smart approach is to be positioned now, before any crisis, in ways that protect you regardless of when or if confiscation happens. If you've diversified internationally, held some numismatic coins, honed foreign mining stocks, and converted some wealth to other hard assets, you're protected. If confiscation happens, you're ready. If it doesn't happen, you still own quality assets that preserve wealth. There's no downside to being prepared. Let me share what I'm personally doing in light of this confiscation risk. I hold precious metals, but I've structured my holdings deliberately. About 40% of my gold and silver is stored in Switzerland in allocated accounts at a private vault. It's outside U.S. jurisdiction and reported properly on my tax filings. About 20% is in the form of certified numismatic coins, pre-1933 gold coins and high-grade Morgan silver dollars that would likely be exempt from any confiscation order. About 20% is in shares of Canadian and Mexican mining companies that operate outside U.S. control. And about 20% is physical metal that I hold privately with no paper trail, stored securely. Additionally, I've diversified beyond just metals. I own productive farmland, I have ownership stakes in several private businesses, I hold some real estate. My wealth is spread across multiple asset classes and jurisdictions, so that no single government action can devastate my net worth. This is prudent asset protection strategy, regardless of confiscation risk. I want to be very clear about something. I'm not telling you this to create panic or to sell you anything. I don't sell precious metals. I don't benefit from you buying or not buying. I'm sharing this information because I believe the confiscation risk is real and underestimated, and because I think people deserve to know what their government is planning so they can make informed decisions about protecting their wealth. The historical precedent is clear. The economic logic is compelling. The leaked documents suggest active planning. The legal framework already exists, and the conditions that would trigger confiscation are developing. Whether you choose to believe this is imminent or unlikely, you should at least consider the possibility and take basic protective measures. Share this video with everyone you know who owns precious metals or cares about financial freedom. This is information that needs to spread. The more people who are aware and prepared, the harder it becomes for the government to implement confiscation successfully. Subscribe to George Vance Live and turn on notifications for updates on this developing situation. Comment below and tell me your thoughts. Do you believe confiscation is possible? Have you taken steps to protect yourself? The government is planning for precious metals confiscation. The documents exist. The legal authority has been established. The economic conditions are aligning. You have a choice. Prepare now while you still can, or wait and hope it never happens. But if it does happen and you're not ready, there's no second chance. Your wealth will be seized at prices the government dictates, and you'll watch helplessly as they revalue the metals higher after taking them from you. Don't let history repeat itself at your expense. This is George Vance Live, exposing the government plans that threaten your freedom and your wealth. Confiscation is not a relic of the past. It's a playbook they're ready to use again. Protect yourself. Diversify internationally. Hold numismatic coins. Own foreign miners. Convert to other hard assets. And whatever you do, don't assume it can't happen here, because it already did, and they're planning to do it again. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay protected, and never trust the government with your financial future.